What if the most useless power in the world was actually the deadliest one ever recorded? A recap that starts with a lie a system tells about itself and ends with a truth nobody saw coming. And what if the note in your pocket told you that you were already dead? Keep that question in mind. By the end of the story, it stops being rhetorical. Silverhelm students spend an entire semester learning what this man picks up in one single night. His name is Daniel Raven, and his gift has no fireballs, no swords, no wings. Just learning, multiplied by 1,000. Harmless, until you realize what happens when a mind like that gets thrown into a world of magic. The first thing Daniel Raven feels is wet, cold grass pressing against his skin. It smells like nothing Chicago ever smelled like. No exhaust, no concrete, no rain on asphalt, just wet earth and something else underneath it. Unnamed. He opens his eyes, and the sky above him is wrong. 2 moons hang there, one white and enormous, the other small with a bluish tinge. He blinks hard. The moons do not disappear. Then something clicks inside his skull. Not a sound, a sensation. Like a cord plugged into a socket that did not exist a second ago. A flat, genderless voice speaks directly into the center of his mind. It does not ask permission. It simply informs him. The way a machine reports a completed calculation. The skill, Thousandfold Efficiency, has been activated. His skill acquisition speed is now multiplied by 1,000 times. Dan sits up slowly. An open book lies beside him on the grass. No memory of how it got there, no memory of anything except everything he actually still remembers. Basic water forms for a freshman, written in letters he did not know a second ago. The cover is worn at the corners, like it has been read 100 times by 100 nervous freshmen. Now, somehow, he reads them perfectly. A language he never studied unlocks itself in his head like a door that was always meant to open for him. A girl looms over him, silver braids swinging like to thick ropes, gray eyes furious. She demands to know his department and why he is lying in the middle of the training field. Her voice cracks with irritation, the kind reserved for people who waste her very limited patience. Dan looks down at his hands. They are not his hands. Younger, thinner. No soldering iron scar on the left palm. A stranger's body, borrowed or given, he does not know which yet. Wearing his own mind like a passenger. He flexes his fingers. They obey him. He tells her he does not remember anything. His voice comes out steady, calm, giving nothing away. It is the first lie of his second life, and it will not be the last one he tells to survive it. And here is where it gets interesting, because that is a lie. He remembers everything. Chicago, his unfinished dissertation, 3 in the morning, coffee gone cold, a cursor blinking on an empty page 4, the hum of a laptop fan in an empty apartment, a kettle tipping over an extension cord, a spark, smoke, darkness. But Daniel Raven never opens his mouth until he understands the rules of a new game. He reaches for the fallen book instead and opens the first page. A circle of water, an elementary structure, 3 simple components. He reads it in for seconds flat, for seconds that should have taken a first-year student the better part of an entire afternoon. Not like a student cramming a formula, like an engineer studying a blueprint. He does not memorize. He reverse engineers. The way you would take apart a watch just to see it tick. He sees straight through it, sees what is essential and what is just decoration. He flips through 5 forms in a row and already feels bored. He raises his palm and pictures a raindrop trembling on glass. Warm mana stirs in his stomach, clumsy, and spirals upward. A perfect sphere of water forms above his hand, the size of a basketball. The textbook promised this would take students to 2 for weeks to learn. 9 seconds against for weeks. Somewhere, a professor's entire lesson plan just became obsolete. Dan simply does not have for weeks. He never has, not in this life or the one before it. Dan did it in 9 seconds. The girl drops her staff, it thuds against the ground. She stares at the sphere, then at him, then back at the sphere again. She asks how he did that. Dan just says he probably remembered. She does not believe a word of it, but she orders him to follow her anyway. Command first, questions later. That Dan will learn is simply how Sadie Corbin operates. Her name is Sadie Corbin, captain of an expedition party, used to commanding, not asking. They cross stone walls and towers flying old flags. This is Silverhelm Academy, one of 6 great academies of the land of Erin. Banners snap overhead in a wind that smells faintly of ozone and crushed grass. Somewhere a bell tolls, deep and slow, marking a class change he knows nothing about yet. Picture a university from centuries ago, except every student carries a fireball instead of a notebook. Towers older than most nations back home rise against a sky with 2 moons, instead of one familiar face. In the infirmary, an old healer runs her dry palm over his head. Physically healthy, she says. Mana at 0, and his memory is gone. This happens after magical shock. she explains calmly, or after a transfer. Transfer, she says it like it is an everyday word. As if people fall out of other worlds onto this training field every other week, and nobody blinks twice. Dan takes careful note of that. Sadie leaves, telling him to find her at the south gate if his memory ever returns. Alone under the stone vault, to moons shine through a narrow window. The system stays silent, no menus, no screens, just one quiet certainty. Two moons keep watch through the narrow window, indifferent to the question forming quietly in his chest. When he looked at that book, he did not see text. He saw a mechanism, and he can take that mechanism apart, then rebuild it in seconds. By dawn, he has memorized all 40 basic forms of water magic. He does not skim. He dissects, turning each formula over like a locksmith testing every pin. He can explain why 8 of them are pointless, and suggest for fixes the textbook missed. One night's work for what an entire semester is supposed to teach. He lays the book down at dawn, exhausted, exhilarated, and terrified in a way he does not yet have words for. In the morning he receives a gray robe with no insignia, a nameless amnesiac, a nobody. He steps into the courtyard where students hurl minor spells like children throwing snowballs. Sparks fizzle out harmlessly against the old stone walls, laughter echoing between the towers. He is dead. He is alive. And he is in another world entirely. 3 facts that should cancel each other out, and somehow all remain true at exactly the same time. He shoves his hands into the robe's pockets and feels something in the right one. A scrap of parchment, one line, written in someone else's hand. Whoever finds this book is already dead, or will be soon. Dan reads it twice, folds it carefully, and puts it back. His hands do not shake. Whatever fear should be there stays locked somewhere deep and quiet. Then he smiles very calmly and goes to look for the library. The Silverhelm library fills for stone floors, shelves vanishing into the dark above. Dan feels like a starving child let loose in a candy shop with no limit on his budget. Dust hangs in shafts of colored light from stained glass windows 3 stories up. The librarian sees the plain gray robe and asks his rank. His eyes flick over the fabric like a man cataloging exactly how little this stranger is worth to him. Temporary resident, Dan says. Ground floor access only, the librarian answers, grimacing. It is exactly the kind of limitation a careful man can work quietly around for a very long time. Dan nods. The ground floor is exactly all he needs for now. He spends 3 days there, leaving only to eat where nobody bothers to look at him twice. Invisibility, he is quickly learning, is its own kind of armor in a world built entirely on reputation. In 3 days he masters the 6 schools of magic: water, fire, earth, air, light, shadow. 213 spells, and he can cast every single one of them. He tests them silently in an empty study room, one after another, cataloging every result in his memory. But here is the real problem sitting underneath all that knowledge. After 5 or 6 mid-tier spells, his mana battery hits 0 just like a cheap phone. He has the processor of a supercomputer and the battery of an alarm clock. A brilliant engine bolted to a battery meant for a child's toy. And somehow he has to win wars with it. So he stops thinking like a mudge and starts thinking like a scientist instead. Every spell becomes a variable. Every duel becomes an equation waiting patiently to be solved. Not one expensive strike costing 80 mana, 20 tiny strikes costing half a point each. A microspark for the tenths of a mana, a drop of static for 1/10. Alone, each one is useless. Nothing a textbook on combat magic would even mention. But nothing in this world has ever been analyzed by someone who used to study human reflex for a living. But Dan does not see spells. He sees a chain of tiny triggers like a reflex. Static on wet grass, plus a shiver underfoot, plus a whisper in the ear equals lost balance. Lost balance, plus the smell of smoke, plus a spark in the corner of the eye equals panic. Panic breaks concentration, a spell collapses. Total cost, barely more than 1 mana point. Pure, cold, beautiful mathematics. He almost laughs out loud at the elegance of it, sitting alone at a cracked wooden table. On the 4th day he wanders into the training arena and watches a duel unfold. 2 students burn through 30 or 40 mana each on spells that are loud, bright, wasteful. Dan silently counts every mistake they make and says nothing out loud. Wasted mana, sloppy footwork. Openings a first year could exploit if anyone ever taught them to look. Then a tall student in a blue robe steps into the arena, and the crowd parts for him instantly. Someone whispers his name. Ralph Hartman, 4th year prefect, heir to the Hartman house. His family's lightning spell has never lost a single duel in 4 years at this academy. A name spoken with the kind of respect that usually means nobody has ever dared to test it. Ralph's gaze lands on Dan's plain gray robe, and he smiles the smile of a man owed a debt. He says he has heard the rumor, the amnesiac who built a perfect water sphere in 10 seconds. He wants to see it for himself, right here, right now. Dan steps into the arena. The crowd falls completely silent. 6 meters of wet grass separate to very different definitions of what power actually means. Ralph does not even bother with the fighting stance. He does not consider Dan a threat at all. Dan looks down at the wet grass, then at Ralph's boots, a dark oil stain on the left one. Small details, meaningless to anyone else. Everything to a man who thinks in mechanisms. The referee signals. Ralph raises his palm, lightning gathering, 1.5 seconds to fire. 1.5 seconds is an eternity to a mind that processes a spell's structure in under one. Dan lifts one single finger. Not a fist, a finger. The smallest possible gesture for what is about to become the loudest possible lesson. For cheap tricks are about to end a 6th-rank family spell in under 2 seconds. Nobody in the crowd has ever seen a fight decided before the first real spell is even cast. And nobody watching has any idea what is about to happen to Ralph Hartman. Move 1. Static on the wet grass under Ralph's right foot, costing 1/10 of a mana point. His boot slips. He does not fall, but his whole body sways off balance. The crowd does not even register it yet. Neither does Ralph. That is exactly the point. Move 2. Resonance humming in his eardrum, costing 4/10 of a point. The world blurs in front of Ralph's eyes for a single heartbeat. A prefect who has never needed to blink through a fight suddenly cannot trust his own vision. Move 3. A microspark aimed at the oil stain on his boot. A small flame catches, not dangerous, but burning right against his skin. Move 4. A puff of air carries the smoke straight into Ralph's nose. All of it happens into seconds flat. Ralph's lightning is 90% charged, but his foot is sliding, his ears are ringing. For separate signals arrive in his brain at once, and his brain, quite simply, panics. His brain receives for danger signals at once, and chooses panic. The lightning slips loose and blasts a crater into the ground beside him instead. Mud and torn grass rain down over a crowd that came expecting a show, and got a mystery instead. Ralph drops to one knee. Dan has spent exactly 1 unit of mana out of his own small reserve. Nobody in that crowd understands what just happened, except one pair of eyes. Gray eyes under silver braids. Sadie Corbin stands frozen by the wall, whispering one question. What did he just do? Ralph gets up, red with shame, and asks what spell Dan used against him. His hands are still trembling slightly, more from confusion than pain. Dan answers honestly, just for basic forms out of the first-year textbook. Rumors explode by evening. By morning, the entire academy knows his name. In the dining hall, a first-year swears he watched Dan catch lightning barehanded and eat it. The story grows with every retelling until people swear he deflected lightning barehanded. Dan decides it is time to disappear, quietly. Before the rumors turn into questions he cannot answer. Attention, he already knows, is the one currency he cannot afford to spend carelessly in this new life. He walks out through the south gate into the drizzle over a city called Wainhold. Sadie finds him there, no longer in student robes, dressed in leather armor with a sword at her belt. She says she wants to understand exactly what he did, not how, but what he was even thinking. Dan explains, for cheap spells aimed at physical weak points, balance, hearing, smell, reflex. Sadie listens with her arms crossed, gray eyes narrowing with something that is not quite suspicion. Sadie says she has a small party for members, rank B- adventurers taking small contracts. Not glory work, not fame work, just the kind of steady, dangerous living that keeps a roof over 5 heads. She calls him either a genius or a psychopath, and says she intends to find out which. Dan holds her gaze a second longer than comfortable, letting her wonder exactly what she has just recruited. Then almost smiles. He says it is entirely possible he is both. Sadie does not smile back, but something in her posture shifts just slightly toward acceptance. Quiet Harbor's headquarters sit in a tavern basement, low ceiling, a map pinned with thumbtacks. 3 women wait inside. Zia, a quiet healer from the eastern lands. She looks up once, and Dan gets the distinct feeling she already understands more than she lets on. Evelyn May Brightwater, tall, red-haired, a smile that never quite leaves her face. Minso Han, a blacksmith with soot on her hands and a hammer hanging at her belt. She does not offer a greeting. She simply keeps working, the way she seems to handle most things in life. Sadie introduces Dan as an amnesiac with strange talent, on trial, nothing more for now. Minso does not look up from her blueprint. Evelyn cannot stop grinning at the newcomer. Trial, a word that means everyone here still has to earn their place, Dan included, starting today. The first quest is simple. Clear a goblin nest 3 hours north for 20 silver coins. Routine, Sadie calls it, for a first mission in a new body, in a new world. It does not feel routine at all. At dawn they set out, Dan watching every step each woman takes. He is not just walking with them. He is studying them, the way he once studied lecture slides. Sadie's stride is measured. Minso's hammer never slows her down. Dan watches everything from the back, cataloging every gesture as if it were a formula on a page. Evelyn keeps glancing nervously at her own palm, afraid her mana will run dry too soon. Dan notices it immediately, filing it away as data. The first real crack in a smile that never seems to fade. Zia's footsteps barely bend the grass, a constant hidden stream of mana cushioning every step. It is such a small detail that nobody else in the party has ever thought to notice it before. Inside the dark, stinking cave, 17 goblins wait, small, green, fast, armed with knives. The air is thick with mold and old blood, torchlight throwing jagged shadows across the walls. Sadie's sword is clean and efficient. Minso's hammer erases anything it touches. Two very different philosophies of violence, both equally effective in the cramped dark of the cave. Evelyn's fireballs land accurately, but they are weak, burning 3 times more mana than needed. For goblins flee into a side tunnel, and one turns back to hurl a knife straight at Zia. Everything slows down for exactly the length of one heartbeat, the way it does right before something breaks. Zia does not see it coming. She is bent over Evelyn's arm, tending a scratch. A single distracted second is all danger ever needs, and it has just found exactly that second. Dan does not think. He raises his hand and pushes a blast of air worth 3/10 of a mana. The knife veers a hand's width and buries itself harmlessly in the cave wall instead. Zia turns, sees the blade lodged in stone, and looks straight at Dan. For a long moment nobody speaks. The cave drips water somewhere in the dark behind them. On the walk home, Sadie finally says the words, "He is staying." No ceremony, no vote, just 4 flat words that quietly change the entire shape of his new life. Minso nods. Zia whispers a quiet thank you. Evelyn just asks what she missed. Small reactions, but together they mark the exact moment this party quietly becomes his family. Dan spent 3/10 of a mana point and saved a life in return. It is the cheapest, most important thing he has done since waking up in this world. A trade he would make again without a single moment of hesitation, no matter the cost to himself. In his last life he wrote a dissertation on how people learn. Now he lives that theory daily. Theory used to live only on paper. Now it lives in mana cost and reflexes. In 5 other people's safety. The first month becomes field training. Goblins, wolves, caravan escorts, glowing mutant rats. Dan works the backlines, watching, counting, memorizing every pattern of every fighter. Every quest becomes another lecture, and he is the only student paying full attention. Sadie's sword work rests on 8 trajectories, brilliant, but predictable on the 6th combination. Minso's blows land with a rhythm passed down through generations of a family Dan has never met. Minso amplifies every hammer blow with earth magic on pure instinct, never realizing it herself. A family gift buried so deep in muscle memory that even its owner has never once questioned it. Zia's healing school controls any liquid in a living body, blood, tears, sweat, with quiet precision. Watching her work feels less like magic and more like watching a surgeon who never needs a single scalpel. 1 demonstration is enough for Dan to understand a technique completely. 2, and he could reproduce it himself, though he rarely lets anyone see just how easily. By month's end he knows every fighting style in the party better than they know it themselves. He could copy any of them. He chooses not to. That kind of imitation would raise too many questions. One evening by the campfire, he sits beside Evelyn, who stares silently at her own hands. He asks to watch her cast her basic fireball just to observe, not to judge. She almost refuses. 5 years of shame do not disappear just because someone finally asked nicely. It takes her a moment to believe he actually means it. Her fireball trembles, burns unevenly, and devours mana like a bonfire eating firewood. Evelyn's shoulders are already tensed for disappointment before Dan has even said a word. His mind breaks the formula apart instantly. 12 elements. 5 of them are pure decoration. She is not weak. She has been taught a formula written for mages with far bigger mana reserves. He asks her to remove 5 useless elements. She hesitates, calling it the standard formula. Dan tells her it was written 100 years ago, and it was never designed for her. She tries it anyway. The fireball shrinks, but steadies and costs 3 times less mana. A small, controlled flame that suddenly looks nothing like the wild, wasteful spark from a minute ago. He points at 2 more elements, tells her to spin the mana flow instead of keeping it circular. It costs nothing extra. It doubles the punch. Evelyn stares at him like he has rewritten gravity itself. The new fireball spins and punches straight through the training target it once only scorched. The wooden dummy has a clean, smoking hole through its chest where a scorch mark used to be. Evelyn stares at the hole, then at her hands, then at him, eyes filling with tears. 5 years she believed she was talentless, ever since her expulsion from Silverhelm. Dan tells her talent was never about the size of her tank, only about knowing the right road. Over the weeks he rewrites all 7 of her spells, each one 3 to 8 times stronger. 7 quiet evenings that undo 5 years of being told she simply was not good enough. On their next quest, she burns down a wyvern with a single strike, and her hands do not shake. For the first time in half a decade, Evelyn looks at her own magic and does not flinch away from it. Sadie watches silently and for the first time gives Dan a look of real respect. It is not gratitude. It is recognition, the kind she reserves only for results, never for words. One evening Minso, who never speaks first, asks how an amnesiac knows so much about magic. Dan says he simply sees the structure of a spell, the way a blacksmith reads the grain of metal. Minso says that is exactly what her father used to do, staring quietly into the past. It is the longest sentence Dan has ever heard her say, and somehow it says everything about her at once. Trust is beginning to grow between them, and Dan knows that trust always brings questions. He welcomes the trust and dreads the questions in almost equal measure. Questions he is not ready to answer, because he is an outsider carrying someone else's gift. Word spreads about the wyvern kill, a B-rank quest, 1 hit, a creature that once needed a squad. Reputation, Dan realizes uneasily, moves through this world far faster than any of them can control it. Sadie took the mission because winter was coming, and the party's money was running dry fast. Dan tracked the wyvern's behavior for 2 days, then lured it down with a howling illusion. Territorial creatures do not tolerate rivals. All he had to do was become one, cheaply. From the shadows, Minso's hammer cracked its wing. Sadie's blade sliced off its poisoned tail. But it still fought hard. Wounded does not mean harmless, and a grounded wyvern is still very much a wyvern. Dan noticed a pattern, a for-tenths of a second pause between the wyvern's attack cycles. He told Evelyn to strike its open mouth in that exact frozen instant. A window for tenths of a second wide, and Dan has already done the math on exactly when it opens. Her spinning fireball flew straight through the creature's throat, burning it from the inside out. It collapsed dead. Evelyn stood there with her hands still raised, eyes wide with disbelief. A creature that would have taken a whole squad, ended by one girl who was told she had no talent at all. Sadie wiped blood from her sword, looked at Dan, and nodded without saying a single word. 60 silver coins split 5 ways, the first coins of this world Dan had ever held in his hand. He turns one over in his palm, studying the stamped profile of a king he has never heard of. That night, Dan could not sleep, replaying the fight in his mind over and over again. Victory tonight feels less like an ending, and more like a very quiet warning about tomorrow. Coordinating for spells in that battle had pushed his brain to a limit he did not yet understand. A limit that feels, for the first time, uncomfortably close instead of comfortably distant. What happens, he wondered, when the enemy needs 20 steps instead of just 4? The question follows him home, sits with him at dinner, and refuses to let him sleep that night. The next morning he asked Sadie for permission to return to the Silverhelm library. He found books describing overload syndrome and battle mages, nosebleeds, fainting, even coma. Words that read less like a warning and more like a countdown clock he cannot yet see. An ordinary mage can juggle 4 or 5 spells at once. A genius manages 12. Dan reads the numbers twice, already suspecting, already dreading, that they will not apply to him at all. The all-time record stands at 18, set 300 years ago. At the cost of the mage's sight, Dan needed to know his own ceiling, so he walked out to an empty field to test it himself. Better to find his limit alone in an empty field than to find it for the first time in front of an enemy. 5 spells, easy. 10, a slight pressure behind his eyes. 15, his skull begins to buzz. 20, blood rushes to his face, his fingers tremble. 25, blood drips from his nose. He stops. 25 spells is his current ceiling, already beyond the world record, but not free. He wipes the blood from his lip with the back of his hand and writes the number down anyway. Back at the house, Zia sees the redness in his eyes and places cool fingers against his forehead. She does not ask permission. She simply checks. The way any good healer checks on someone they trust. She feels the micro damage in his brain and warns him plainly that this cannot continue forever. She says he is burning himself out exactly the way Evelyn once burned through mana carelessly. The irony is not lost on either of them. The teacher repeating the very mistake he corrected in a student. Dan smiles, genuinely, for the first time in a month, because she has read him completely. It is a small, tired smile, But it is real, and real has been in short supply lately. Money runs out fast in the second month. Rent, food, gear repairs, sharpening a warhammer. Sadie drops a tournament flyer on the table. 500 silver for first place in Caravan Hall. Half a year's rent in a single prize, and half a year's worth of exposure in a single arena. Dan agrees to help, but only from the sidelines, coordinating, analyzing, never stepping into the ring. The arena can have the show. Dan will keep the part that actually decides who wins it. For a week straight, every evening becomes a training camp out on a vacant lot under two moons. Sweat, bruises, and the same corrections repeated until muscle memory finally starts to listen. He shows Sadie her own blind spot, a predictable sixth combination she never noticed in 10 years. 10 years of muscle memory. And it takes a stranger 3 days to see what an entire academy never taught her. She adds a feint, a fake swing to break her own rhythm, and within a week it becomes instinct. A new habit layered gently over 10 years of old ones until it stops feeling new at all. He shows Minso that she has been unconsciously enhancing every hammer blow with buried earth magic. She learns to control it consciously, from a gentle tap to a full-blown earthquake strike. A dial where there used to be only one setting, and suddenly her whole arsenal doubles overnight. He asks Zia if she could slow an opponent's blood for 1 single second, not to harm, just to pause. It is a small request that quietly redefines what her entire healing school could someday become. It is forbidden technique, she warns, but she agrees to try it, testing the pause carefully on Dan. Evelyn gets new tricks, a blinding flash grenade, and a narrow wall of fire for controlling space. Tools built not to overpower an enemy, but to decide exactly where that enemy is allowed to stand. Dan draws the whole battle plan on the dirt, assigning every roll, every flank, every single word cue. One word, at the right instant, is worth more than any spell any of them has ever cast in battle. By the end of 10 days, 5 women move together like one single mechanism, imperfect, but in sync. For the first time, Dan feels less like an outsider watching a party, and more like part of one. Caravan Hall is bigger than Wainhalt, stone walls, wide streets, an arena built for 1,000 eyes. It is the biggest stage Dan has stood near since he arrived in this world, and he does not intend to be seen on it. The organizer eyes for girls and a rankless boy skeptically before writing down their entry anyway. He does not expect them past the first round. Very few people in the city will guess correctly tonight. 30 to teams, 5 rounds, and the first match waits for them tomorrow morning. Somewhere in those stands sit judges from every academy, every kingdom, every faction watching closely. Somewhere in that bracket sits every kind of danger this world has to offer, and none of it announces itself. That evening, Sadie sits beside Dan in the empty stands and says she already knows he is lying. No amnesiac analyzes a battle like a military strategist, or coaches like someone who has done it for years. Sadie has watched him too closely for too long to keep pretending. She has not noticed the gaps in his story. She says she will ask someday, and when she does, she wants the truth, nothing less. It is not a threat. It is simply Sadie Corvin, stating a fact about the future the way she states everything. Dan promises he will answer honestly, even if the truth sounds impossible to believe. It is the first promise he has made in this entire world that he actually intends to keep completely. The first round is almost too easy for fighters who are strong alone but helpless together. Quiet Harbor dismantles them in 40 seconds, and the crowd falls silent, confused rather than bored. They came expecting spectacle. What they got instead looked disturbingly like inevitability. The second round brings mirrored twin swordswomen and a shadow mage casting zones of darkness. Dan gives 3 words: do not step into the shadows. 3 words that turn a chessboard of darkness into a trap. The shadow mage built entirely for himself. Sadie finds right and strikes left, breaking the twins' mirrored rhythm completely apart. Evelyn burns away the smoke bomb with one bright flash, exposing the blinded shadow mage. Darkness only works as a weapon until someone remembers that light is simply the cheaper answer. Zia freezes him with a single second of slowdown, and Sadie's blade ends the match in moments. Surprise ripples through the crowd. Who are these unknown fighters from provincial Wainhalt? Someone in the upper stand starts scribbling notes. Nobody notices him yet. That will change soon. The third round brings real soldiers, a shield bearer, a spearman, a wind mage, and a precise fire mage. Dan studies them all evening, noticing the spearman favors his left hand despite eating right-handed. Small habits give away more than any spell ever could, if someone is patient enough to watch for them. His plan: force the shield bearer to turn by burning the air behind his own back. Unseen and unexpected. Instinct always wins over training in the end. And instinct is exactly what Dan intends to weaponize here. The heat hits, the shield wavers half a second, and that gap is all Sadie needs to slip through. Zia slows the fire mage's hand. Minso shatters the spearman's weapon with one clean hammer strike. When a stray fireball flies towards Sadie, Dan flicks it aside from behind the railing. Unnoticed by most, but not all, somewhere in the crowd, careful eyes are already starting to take notes. The match ends in 2 minutes 10 seconds. The stands do not just cheer, they roar. For a moment, Dan lets himself feel something close to pride, quickly buried under old habit. After the fight, a man in a gray cloak approaches Dan, introducing himself as Royal Intelligence. Dan declines the offer flatly. The man's smile disappears, and he calls it more of a recommendation. Recommendations from men like that, Dan already understands, rarely stay polite for very long. Dan watches him walk away, understanding clearly that this is only the first hunter to come looking. He does not tell the others yet. Some weights are easier to carry alone, at least for one more night. The semifinal brings an A-ranked team led by a calm, lazy, dangerously skilled ice mage. Dan senses immediately that his usual tricks will not work against true professionals like these. Professionals do not panic at smoke or noise. They will need a mistake built into the very ground they stand on. His new plan targets the mage's icy platform itself. A hidden gap of air between the ice and the sand. A shield that guards against attacks head-on. Has no answer for something aimed straight into the ground. Evelyn fires a tiny, dense, spinning sphere beneath the shield's barrier, straight into the sand below. The sand melts into molten glass, cracking the ice platform from underneath in an instant. The mage's feet sink into scorching heat, his concentration shattered, his spear melting mid-cast. Zia freezes him for 1 second. Sadie's blade reaches his throat before he can even react. He surrenders. 1,000 voices erupt at once. An unranked, unknown party is beaten in A-team. Evelyn's hands are still shaking, not from fear this time, but from the sheer scale of what she just did. Somewhere above the noise, two very different kinds of hunters quietly begin comparing notes. In the crowd, two pairs of eyes fixed directly on Dan, an intelligence agent and a woman in black. Her robe bears 7 interlocking angles, the mark of the Black Guild, and she is smiling right at him. Dan holds her gaze for exactly 1 second before looking away, filing her face carefully into memory. Dan realizes 2 hunters have already found him tonight, and a third is likely somewhere close behind. The final match is called Blades of Dawn, rank A+, undefeated, led by a fast swordwind mage named Selena. Dan barely sleeps, calculating a plan built entirely around Selena's aggressive, impatient nature. Habit breeds carelessness, he reminds himself, over and over, until the words stop sounding like a theory. Quiet Harbor will retreat on purpose, letting her push forward until her formation stretches thin. It works exactly as predicted. Selena outruns her own lightning mage, opening a 5-meter gap. Dan counts the gap in his head like a stopwatch, waiting for the exact instant it becomes fatal. Minso slams her hammer into the ground with full magical force, knocking the lightning mage flat. Full force, for the first time in public, and the ground itself seems to flinch along with him. Dan deflects a stray arrow aimed at Minso's chest. The same trick, the same gray robe. Unnoticed by none. Evelyn blinds Selena with a flash of white light. Sadie sweeps her legs and pins her blade to her throat. Selena stares up at the sky and surrenders. The stands erupt loud enough to be heard beyond the walls. An undefeated party is just lost to a plan built entirely on losing on purpose for the first minute. Quiet Harbor wins 500 silver, secured entirely by a man who never once stepped into the sand. Sadie stands in the arena afterward, sword lowered, staring at the man behind the barrier who won it for her. That night Zia sits beside him quietly and notices the drop of blood he wiped from his own nose. She says nothing at first, just watches, the way she always watches before she decides to speak. An air blast should never cause bleeding, she says, so something else was taxing his brain instead. She promises not to push for answers, but says she will be there whenever he is ready to talk. Dan realizes she has read him completely, calculating 20 variables at once, pain and blood, not mana. He says nothing. She does not push. It is enough, for now, that someone finally sees it. There is a strange relief in being seen, even partially, even by someone who is choosing not to push yet. Quiet Harbor returns home as heroes, and the Seekers Guild officially raises their rank to A. Dan's badge reads simply, first name Daniel, no surname, rank A, specialization, support. Nobody dreams of becoming a support class. For Dan, invisibility is exactly the perfect disguise. A badge with no last name feels almost like freedom, a blank page nobody else can write on yet. They move into a proper house on the edge of town, 5 rooms, a smithy shed, a well in the yard. Dan takes the attic, a low ceiling, a skylight open to 2 moons, and begins organizing all he knows. 312 spells now. 12 cascading combinations tested in real combat. A library inside his own skull, growing faster than his body can ever hope to keep up with. His mana grows slower than his knowledge ever could. 10 units, now barely 12 after 2 months. It is the one thing Thousandfold Efficiency cannot rush, no matter how hard his mind pushes against it. A polite letter arrives, signed by the rector of Silverhelm, inviting Quiet Harbor to collaborate. Polite words, wrapped carefully around an offer that Dan reads as a very well-disguised trap. Sadie replies with exactly 4 words. Thank you. We're not interested. 4 words that close a door most people in this world would have given anything to walk through. 3 nights later, Dan wakes to a footstep on the roof. Quiet, deliberate, moving toward his window. The house has been quiet for 3 days. Quiet, Dan is learning fast, never lasts very long here. He strikes with a cheap air blast the instant a silhouette blocks the moonlight, and the intruder falls. A single tenth of a mana point, and an entire kidnapping plot ends face down in the dirt of their own yard. On the ground lies an unconscious man clutching a vial of sleeping potion strong enough for a horse. On his wrist, a tattoo, 7 interlocking angles. The Black Guild sent a kidnapper in the night. The city guard turns pale at the sight of the mark and calls it a kingdom-level matter, not their own. He writes his short report quickly, takes the unconscious man away, and does not look back at the house. That same evening, the intelligence agent returns to the doorstep, calling himself Ren Alistaster. He describes an enemy called the Nameless Mage, active on the eastern border. Magic outside any codex. 3 elite squads, gone, and nobody in intelligence can explain exactly how or why. A name that means nothing to most of the room, and something Dan cannot quite shake off since hearing it. 3 elite squads sent against him never returned, and Ren needs minds that think outside every rule. He says he watched Dan predict 2 impossible moves at the tournament, and reacted in a fraction of a second. Flattery wrapped around a recruitment pitch, and Dan can hear the second part far more clearly than the first. Dan asked one question only. What kind of magic does the Nameless Mage actually use in battle? Every time is different, Ren admits. He never repeats a spell. He creates new ones in the heat of combat. Something cold and curious stirs in Dan's chest, because that should be impossible by every rule he knows. Every spell in every book he has ever read follows structure. This is not. That fact will not leave him alone. Curiosity, he will later realize, is exactly the hook this whole story has been waiting to catch him with. Sadie warns him afterward that the Nameless One is not their problem, that adventurers are not an army. That night, alone in the attic, Dan stares at the scrap of parchment still folded in his palm. It has traveled with him through every quest, every fight, every quiet night since the very beginning. Whoever finds this book is already dead, or will be soon. The questions keep multiplying with no answers. But one lead has finally emerged from the fog. A name, the Nameless Mage. A name with no face yet, but somehow already the loudest thing in the room whenever it is spoken. Sooner or later, Dan knows that conversation is coming, whether he is ready for it or not. He closes his eyes under the silent moons and lets the questions sit there unanswered. For one more night. The 3rd month opens with blood, his own this time, spilling from testing his mana limit alone. He pushes past 25 spells to 30, and a white flash drops him face first into the grass. For a moment there is only white noise, and then there is only grass. Wet and cold, exactly like the first day. Zia finds him unconscious, blood pouring from nose and ears, and warns of irreversible damage in months. It is the closest thing to real fear Dan has ever seen cross her usually composed face. She tells him plainly not to raise the ceiling, but to lower the cost of every single spell instead. Dan realizes his mistake instantly. He has been brute forcing a problem that needed real understanding. It is the same mistake he once corrected in Evelyn's fireball, and it takes Zia to point it back at him. The answer is sequence, not parallel weight. 30 spells cast one after another in mere seconds. A different kind of speed entirely. Safe where brute force was slowly killing him one nosebleed at a time. Fast enough that no observer could ever tell the difference from a single simultaneous blast. 6 hours a day of training later, he cast 20 spells sequentially in 3 seconds. With no nosebleed. One evening, Zia shows him a broken fragment of her grandmother's old water technique from childhood. Her hands shake slightly, half remembering a gesture she has not needed since she was a very small girl. Dan's mind reconstructs the missing pieces instantly, like an architect spotting a door in an empty wall. The water in a mug rises into the shape of an old woman, smiling. Remembering a face long lost to time, Zia weeps silently, saying he has brought her grandmother back to her after 15 years of silence. The little water figure tilts its head one last time before dissolving quietly back into the mug. Over the following month, Dan restores 12 lost techniques of a dying school of magic through her memory. Every evening becomes a quiet ritual of grief and rebuilding, one gesture at a time, one tear at a time. 3 elderly masters in the eastern lands are all that remain of that school, now saved from extinction. A dying tradition, quietly pulled back from the edge by a man who once studied dead languages for fun. In the 4th month, a woman named Caitlin O'Donnell simply appears at the kitchen table one morning. A former Royal Intelligence agent, now a deserter, tracker, an archer, an old friend of Sadie's. She drinks Sadie's tea like she already owns the mug, and somehow nobody argues with her about it. She warns that intelligence will not back off much longer, and that a formal summons is coming soon. Kate is smoke where the others are steel or sun or stone, charming everyone as a shield against fear. Charm, Dan recognizes instantly, is just another kind of armor for people who never learn to feel safe. One night on the rooftop, she admits intelligence found no record of Dan anywhere in any kingdom at all. She tells him her own past, taken at 12, broken down, rebuilt, escaping only on her 3rd attempt. To people who both know what it costs to be remade by forces bigger than themselves. Sitting quietly under two moons, Dan crafts her a quiet gift, a modified silent spell. So she could leave any night with nobody hearing. It is not a leash. It is proof that nobody in this house will ever hold her back against her will. Kate calls him an idiot, disappears behind a closed door, and comes back with red eyes and a softer smile. It is the same word Sadie used months ago. In this house, apparently. It means something closer to trust. She says simply that she is staying. 2 words that cost her more than any bow she has ever drawn in her entire life. The 6th month brings the first real trouble, a queen wyvern 3 times the usual size, guarding a nest. She is smarter than any beast they have fought, circling, attacking blind spots, never falling for tricks. Sadie takes a tail strike to the ribs. Minso takes a claw across the arm shielding her captain. Dan burns through his entire mana reserve in one sequence, and the creature only staggers, still standing. Evelyn's fireball lodges in its throat, but it survives and charges straight toward her. Unstoppable. Zia steps in front of her, slowing a beast blood for the first time. 10 times harder than any human. Blood runs from her own nose from the strain. A healer paying a price no textbook ever warned her about. Blood streams from Zia's own nose from the overload, but the wyvern freezes just long enough. Minso's enchanted hammer crashes into the base of its skull, and the creature finally collapses dead. For a moment nobody moves. The silence after a fight this close feels heavier than the fight itself. Dan stands there empty-handed, useless in the final second, and realizes his strategy has a hard limit. It works against people with patterns. It fails completely against raw, chaotic, animal instinct. Mana grows to slowly, to units in 2 months. At this rate real strength is a decade away. At least, and the hunters are already closing in, and the nameless one is somewhere out there, waiting patiently. Dan lies awake that night listening to 5 different breathing patterns, and thinking about all of it. The solution arrives from Minso that same evening. An old scorched blueprint from her late father's hands. Edges burned by time, corners softened by years of being folded and unfolded in grief. A blade that does not kill, a phrase she never understood for 10 long years after his death. Dan's mind unravels it instantly. Not a weapon, an artifact. 200 embedded dispersing formulas. A blade built to neutralize an enemy's magic entirely, drawing power from the very spell it cancels. There is even an empty gap in the design, as if her father somehow knew a 7th magic type would come. A blank space left on purpose, as if the old blacksmith had been waiting for someone like Dan all along. Every evening for 2 months, Minso forges while Dan weaves 3 fresh formulas into the blade at a time. 60 evenings, 200 formulas. Minso talks quietly about her father while the metal glows. The forge fire lights her face the same way it must have lit her father's, years before she was old enough to remember clearly. On the 53rd evening, the blade is finished, long, narrow, silver with a faint blue sheen. Minso presses it to her forehead, closes her eyes, and whispers one single word, Dad. They name the blade Silent, in honor of the party, and in honor of what it truly represents. Minso hangs it beside her hammer, one weapon for striking, one for standing quietly against the dark. Meanwhile, Dan's name spreads far beyond Wainholt, twisted into legend, called simply the Thousander. By now the name means less about who he is, and more about what people need him to be. In the 8th month, a second letter arrives, addressed to Dan alone, from Rector Cornelius Wald himself. An invitation to the Council of the 6 Academies not as a student, but as a consultant on education. Dan reads the trap for exactly what it is, a stage designed to showcase him, then keep him forever. A golden cage dressed up as an honor, offered by a man who has never once had to ask twice for anything. But he sees a way to turn the very trap against its maker, and decides to walk straight into it. The council chamber in the capital city is enormous, 6 sectors, 6 rectors, hundreds of watching eyes. Wald introduces him grandly, expecting a dazzling personal performance to prove his worth in person. 300 pairs of eyes wait for a magic trick. Dan is about to give them a syllabus instead. Instead, Dan speaks not about himself, but about a broken system built on 200 years of habit. He calls it an assembly line producing narrow specialists who understand only their own single box. A fire mage who cannot read ice. An ice mage who cannot read wind. An entire system built to keep people small. The nameless mage wins, he says, precisely because he was never taught to see only one narrow box. He hands over a full workbook, 120 pages, every method laid bare for anyone to learn. Without him, he says plainly, the method still works, the man is unnecessary, the book is the gift. Wald's expectant smile disappears. He had hoped to cage a star, and instead received a printable textbook. For one long second, the most powerful man in the hall has absolutely nothing left to say. Some rectors applaud. Not all, but enough. Wald has lost, publicly, in front of every kingdom watching. It is not the applause that matters. It is the silence underneath it. The sound of an old order cracking slightly. Afterward, Wald warns him quietly that the Nameless One will not stop, and a manual alone won't be enough. Dan agrees that may be true, but says calmly that today simply is not that particular day. Sadie tells him outside that he has just declared war on the most powerful man in the magical world. Dan corrects her gently. He only gave away a test for free, nothing more, nothing less than that. As they leave the capital, Kate spots 3 separate hunters trailing them through the shadows. Intelligence, the Black Guild, and a Silverhelm cloak. Every faction now has a piece on the board. Kate counts them off on her fingers like a grocery list, calm in a way that unsettles Dan more than fear would. Dan walks on without looking back. He is no longer a pawn caught between them. He has become a player. 1 year and 7 months after that first cold night, Dan stands alone in an open field at dawn. He told his party he was scouting the Eastern Road. That was a lie. He is here for something else. Kate intercepted a report 3 days earlier, an apprentice of the Nameless One moving west, alone. Her decryption skills, she says flatly, never really rust. No matter how many years pass between uses. Not killing intelligence patrols, erasing them instead, wiping memory clean, leaving no trace at all. Whole squads return home smiling, greeting their families, remembering nothing of what erased them. Dan stands there, hands in his pockets, the old parchment still gripped tightly in his right hand. A figure steps out of the darkness itself, young yet ageless, barefoot, calm as still water. He says his teacher has spoken of Dan before, calling him the vessel, the one who learns but does not understand. Dan asks flatly what vessel means. The apprentice only tilts his head, like a bird studying a worm. He raises one hand, and magic pours out that belongs to no known school, no known codex. Nothing at all. Dan's mind, trained to dissect any spell in an instant, finds nothing to grab onto at all. The blade of condensed air that flies at Dan is built from principles that simply should not exist. Dan barely dodges it, feeling heat and cold at once, and immediately fires back his fastest sequence. 20 spells launch in 3 seconds flat, the fastest sequence he has ever produced under real pressure. 20 strikes, each one precise, each one hitting balance, hearing, sight, reflex, concentration. Every single spell dissolves against the apprentice, like raindrops disappearing into an endless ocean. 20 precise strikes, 20 perfect calculations, and every one of them simply ceases to matter. The ground beneath Dan's feet turns soft and hungry, pulling at him as if the soil itself wants him gone. He tears free, leaving his boots behind in the earth, bare feet suddenly cold against the wet grass. He tries a new combination entirely, and the apprentice adapts instantly, matching him move for move. By the 3rd minute, Dan understands with total clarity that he is losing this fight badly. Not losing as in outmatched, losing as in speaking a language the other side has never needed to learn. Every spell he owns is a combination of someone else's pieces. The apprentice speaks an entirely new language. A blow strikes his chest, both hot and cold at once, a paradox his own body cannot process at all. Pain arrives late, confused, as if his nervous system needs an extra second just to understand what happened. He is thrown backward, ribs aching, blood on his lip, and forces himself back up onto his feet. A second below, light that is somehow also darkness, burns his raised palms with something unnamed. Not a burn, not frostbite. Something in between that has never needed a name until tonight. A third blow, sound turned into raw physical force, slams into him like an invisible closed fist. A scream given weight, given mass, hitting him like a fist made entirely out of noise. Dan loses consciousness completely, falling face first into the same wet grass he first woke up on. He wakes seconds later, blood pouring from nose and ears, mana at absolute zero, legs barely holding him. The apprentice waits patiently, watching. The way a teacher waits for a student to finish a difficult test. A fourth blow drops Dan again, and he lies there thinking clearly despite the pain radiating everywhere. Not even a spell this time, just raw unshaped power, thrown almost carelessly like an afterthought. Combination is powerless here. Cascades are powerless. Every trick he ever built means nothing right now. He recalls his unfinished dissertation, the 4 stages of learning any skill, ending in true mastery. Conscious competence thinks through every step. Unconscious mastery simply creates without thinking at all. The apprentice stands at that final stage. Dan realizes he himself has only ever reached the 3rd. A borrowed masterpiece is still a masterpiece, he thinks bitterly, but it will never be a birth. For a year and a half he has been the fastest combinator alive, using only other people's pieces. And that, right now, in this field, under the frozen moons, is simply not enough to survive. He forces himself to stand again, blood on his chin, one eye blind. Mana reduced to a final fraction. His legs shake, his vision swims. Something underneath the pain refuses, absolutely refuses, to stay down. He raises his hand, not for a cascade, not for a combination, but for something entirely his own. He thinks of his own death specifically, precisely, the exact second the wires sparked in Chicago. A kettle, boiling water spilling onto an extension cord. A short circuit finding the path of least resistance. That is what killed him. Not fire, not smoke, pure sudden electrical release with nowhere else to go. He does not search his memory for a formula. He thinks only of the principle underneath it. For the first time in a year and a half, he is not borrowing anyone's blueprint at all. Energy exists. A conductor is needed. Not copper wire this time, but water, moisture. The damp night air. Millions of invisible droplets, hanging quietly in the space between two people who are about to change everything. Millions of invisible droplets hang suspended between his palm and the apprentice's chest right now. He releases every last drop of mana into that thin, unseen thread of moisture, all at once. Not a spell shaped by gesture or form, but a raw discharge finding its own natural path forward. The world freezes white for a single hundredth of a second, exactly like that spark back in Chicago. Somewhere between two worlds. A dead man's last ordinary memory becomes a living man's first true spell. Then the apprentice flies backward, 3 meters through the air, and crashes down onto his back. For the first time in 17 long minutes, he is the one lying broken on the wet grass, not Dan. Smoke rises from a burn on his chest unlike anything this world has ever produced before, ever. Because there is no electricity in this world. There never was. Until Daniel Raven brought it here himself. Dan stands with his arm raised, fingers smoking, skin blackened, blood running from nose and ears freely. But he stands. He names it later. The silence of the kettle, born from death. Not from any borrowed book. It costs him almost everything he has left, and it is the first thing in this world that is truly only his own. His first true original spell, created from nothing but memory and desperate necessity. The apprentice rises slowly, steam rising from a deep burn on his chest. Standing up for the very first time. He looks at Dan with something like recognition, as if finding exactly what he had been sent to find. He says his teacher will be pleased, that the vessel is no longer empty, but beginning to fill itself. He turns and simply walks away, barefoot across the wet grass, fading into shadow, and then into nothing. He does not look back once. Some tests, Dan realizes, only need to be passed a single time. Dan collapses to his knees, breathing hard, every rib and muscle screaming with pain and exhaustion. On a hill a kilometer away, a hooded silhouette watches silently. A figure Dan somehow already knows. 20 years of waiting, standing quietly on a hill, watching the last piece finally click into place. The nameless Mitch himself. The man who began a ritual 20 years ago, searching endlessly for a vessel. Dan cannot see him smile from this distance, but he feels it. The way you feel warmth through a wall. One word crosses that distant figure's lips, unheard, but somehow understood anyway. It worked. The nameless one turns and disappears over the hill, vanishing into darkness like his apprentice before him. Kneeling alone, bloodied, burned, mana completely drained. Dan finally understands his own true nature. Every certainty he built over a year and a half rearranges itself in the space of a single breath. He was never simply a gifted outsider. He is the result of a 20-year experiment, nothing more. The ritual required a vessel, a soul from a world without magic, empty, unburdened, ready to be filled. His death in Chicago was never an accident. It happened exactly when and where it needed to happen. The book waiting beside him that first night, the warning note in his pocket, all of it, planned in advance. Whoever finds this book is already dead, or will be soon, not a threat, a simple statement of fact. But the Nameless One smiled tonight, not because the ritual worked, but because Dan created something new. That distinction matters more than anything else that has happened to him since he opened his eyes on wet grass. Not from any codex, not from combination, his own. And that changes absolutely everything now. 5 lanterns appear on the horizon, moving fast. Faster than any normal running pace could ever manage. Sadie runs first, silver braids loose and flying behind her like a banner in the cold night wind. Behind her, Minso with her hammer, Zia with her satchel of potions, Evelyn lighting the way with fire. Kate brings up the rear, bow drawn, eyes scanning the darkness even now. Old habits never truly dying. Sadie reaches him first, falling to her knees in the mud, gripping his burned shoulders with both hands. Her braids are loose, undone, flying behind her the entire way here, faster than she has ever run before. She calls him an idiot, her voice cracking, tears she refuses to acknowledge shining in her eyes. Zia works immediately, cold hands on his temples, healing burst capillaries, mending burns, stopping blood. Minsa stands guard facing the darkness, silent, weapon in one hand, the artifact blade in the other. 2 weapons for 2 different kinds of danger, and she trusts herself equally with both of them tonight. Kate keeps her bow raised toward the empty field, refusing to trust silence even now that danger has passed. Sitting there, hand tightly held by Sadie, Dan finally says he is ready to answer her old question. His voice is hoarse, cracked at the edges, but steady enough to carry every word that follows. The one she asked in the stands at Craven Hall, promising that one day she would want the truth. He tells her everything. Chicago, his dissertation, the kettle, the spark, his own death at 3 a.m. A world without magic, but with electricity, machines, and people who write dissertations instead of living. His gift was never truly his own. It came from someone else's 20-year-old ritual, aimed directly at him. Sadie listens without a single interruption, without ever loosening her grip on his hand, not once. Her thumb moves once across his burned knuckles, small, careful, like checking something is still real. Minso turns from the darkness to listen to. Zia keeps healing, but her eyes stay sharp and attentive. Evelyn's mouth hangs slightly open. Kate finally lowers her bow, for the first time all night. When he finishes, silence stretches long across the wet field under the frozen, watching moons. Even the wind seems to wait for someone to speak first, unwilling to break whatever this moment is. Sadie speaks first, saying his strange knowledge, his strange habits. All of it finally makes sense now. Then she says plainly that she does not care where he came from. Not even slightly, not at all. A year and a half of watching him choose them, every single day, matters far more than where he started. She says he rewrote every one of their lives individually, a spell, a school, a blade, a silence, a home. She calls him an idiot again for going alone, but her voice is softened completely by now. It is the 4th time someone in this family has called him that. He is starting to understand why. Zia finishes healing and says quietly that she always knew he was special, just not quite how special. Minso calls him a blacksmith, someone who looks at broken people the way her father looked at worn metal. Evelyn admits she was terrified hearing all of this, but says if he fixed her, he will fix everything else too. Kate admits intelligence never found a single record of him anywhere, and calls him theirs regardless. She says it flatly, like a fact already settled long before tonight, not up for further discussion. Ownership for Kate has never meant control. Tonight it simply means nobody is taking him anywhere. They lift him together, carefully, Sadie and Zia bearing his weight, Minsa leading, Evelyn lighting the path. Walking home, Dan thinks about the choice still waiting somewhere ahead, immortality alone, or mortal life with them. It is a question with no easy answer, and for once, he lets himself set it down until morning. He decides that choice belongs to another day, not tonight. Not while he can still walk among his people. Immortality can wait. Right now there are 5 sets of footsteps matching his own, uneven, unhurried, present. Sadie asks why he is smiling despite the blood on his teeth and the pain in every single bone. He tells her it is his old dissertation, the one about how people truly learn, finally answered. People learn, he says, when they finally have someone worth learning for. Sadie squeezes his hand tighter. He squeezes back, just as firmly, just as certain. Hundreds of battles still wait somewhere ahead, the nameless one, the ritual, the politics. The hunt? The council will not forget him. The guild will not forget him. None of that changes what tonight was. None of it disappears just because tonight ended well, it simply waits, patiently. The way it always has. But all of that waits for later. Tonight there are only warm lanterns. And 5 people who came running. 5 people who heard an impossible truth and chose to stay anyway, calling him an idiot with love. Not one of them flinched when he said another world. Not one of them let go of his hand or his shoulder. For the first time since he woke up on that cold, wet grass, Dan walks home without counting his steps. No calculations. No cascades. Just 5 people beside him. And a warm light waiting at the end of the road. The Thousander, born from a kettle and a spark, has finally learned the one lesson no book ever taught him. Understanding is not knowledge borrowed from others. It is something built only from what you have survived. It is the answer to a dissertation question he asked in a different life, in a different language, as a different man. Daniel Raven died once in a world without magic, and lived twice in a world that gave him a family instead. The second life did not begin with the system's voice. It began with silver braids and a furious question. And that, more than any spell, more than any rank, is the only vessel worth ever truly filling. Not empty and waiting to be used. Full finally. Of something nobody else designed or planned or owns. End of the recap. But for Daniel Raven, this is only the very beginning of everything still to come.